If you've seen more than one movie or read more than one book created by either Americans or Western Europeans, you've likely encountered this guy. More or less, unless the only media you've consumed is Boss Baby, you have been introduced to the archetype of the evil Slav. This is a trope that takes on literally dozens if not hundreds of forms and is something you've encountered both in ways that you can easily identify and in ways you probably didn't. I first mentioned this topic back during the lazy world building video, which is still hard carrying the channel, and there was a fair amount of interest expressed in it, so hopefully I'll be able to do it justice. While I'm not going to be alarmist and say this is a massive problem that happens all the time constantly, it has been a lurking, ever-present issue that has waxed and waned with time. And that will make up a lot of what we're talking about as we discuss this trope throughout history. Our discussion starts at Part 1, Victorian Anti-Easternism. Now, while it is certainly true to say that Western distaste for Eastern Europeans definitely originated far before the Victorian era, and there is an entire history of the conflicts between those two vaguely defined people groups, our focus here is on this idea representing itself in media. And that, I would say, came about for the most part during the Victorian era, as said. Prepare for a little bit of history. Those of you who are versed in the era will probably already know why this is, but for those who aren't, the Victorian era is possibly the most defining set of decades modern Western culture has experienced, largely as a result of Napoleon's defeat setting a new precedent for the balance of power in Europe after that whole Congress of Vienna, and because of that Industrial Revolution thing, which I certainly hope you've heard of at least. While there is literally an endless amount of things to discuss about this period, we'll be talking about two relevant concepts: the diametric opposition between England and Russia as the dominant powers of the continent and opposing heads of political thought throughout Europe, and the proliferation of popular literature for the first time, really. We'll start with that opposition because it gives context to the thing that sparked off anti-Slavism, which I guess we'll call this, as a force that specifically was prolific within the media, and amplified by it, really. While there are plenty of other groups the media has been biased against throughout history, obviously, especially Victorian media, I find the anti-Slavism the most interesting, for lack of a better word, because of how consistently it has continued to appear over the centuries. But to put us in the era, it's 1815 and we're sitting at the Congress of Vienna. Negotiations over the future of Europe are concluded with a clear goal: to prevent large-scale wars between major European powers for the foreseeable future. As we all know, this eventually came to not work, but within the lifetimes of those who settled it, it was actually generally the case. Most European conflicts between the Congress of Vienna and the First World War were essentially a result of Prussian militarism and expansion, though there were some exceptions, and that's all getting a bit off topic. From the Congress of Vienna, two opposing heads emerged: England, the bastion of industrialism and liberalism, and Russia, the bastion of traditionalism and conservatism. Whatever you might think about this dichotomy, this set the two essentially at odds until the aforementioned First World War, which itself only had the alliances it did because Austria screwed Russia over a bit earlier, and there was some complicated stuff going on in the Balkans. So the Tsar moved towards other allies, namely France, who was already allied with the UK. Throughout the following century, the UK and Russia only directly fought during the Crimean War, but even that was a pretty limited conflict. But culturally and geographically, they competed in a lot of key areas, namely Central Asia and India. And then, of course, one of the various reasons Russia sold Alaska to the US was because they really didn't stand any practical chance of holding on to it against British invasion. From a certain point of view, it was itself something of a proto-Cold War, just without the nukes. Due to the relative lack of actual armed conflict, soft power played out a lot during this time, and in particular, this expressed itself in the world of literature, which Russia and England kind of dominated, despite excellent novels coming out of many other regions. I mean, it's what they have you read in high school: Brit Lit and Dostoevsky. While Russian writers, particularly Dostoevsky, who I've read a little bit about, conflicted with Western views in their writing, it didn't seem particularly common for them to directly portray Western cultures in some way as barbaric or worse. Though I am positive there probably definitely really were examples of such, particularly in terms of comparison, but it wasn't the tendency so much. Russian literature was fairly introspective, I think it's fair to say, or at the very least, it was mostly about its own culture and those that directly surrounded the empire, which does kind of make sense. The same definitively cannot be said the other way around, which, considering that Britain and the West in general were busy imperializing cultures that they saw as faraway savages, may not be all that surprising. Of course, Russia was imperializing too, don't get me wrong, but they were targeting things they shared a land border with, so the dynamic was, to vastly oversimplify, different. It is British, or in this case Irish actually, literature, in which we'll find our example of where this anti-Eastern Europe-ism starts to express itself, and we'll point at Bram Stoker's Dracula, to which immediately you should say, "But J-Bat, Dracula is Transylvanian and of Hungarian origin. Neither of those are even Slavic." And you're right, but you should realize we're dealing with ethnic hatred, which does not in fact make these distinctions very intelligently. To simplify, British hatred for the backwards Russian has resulted in anyone east or south of the Danube catching strays, be they Slavic or Russian or not. You'll be seeing this general effect again, and I use Dracula for another very, very specific reason that I'll mention later. One of the most common signifiers of anti-Slavism, or anti-anything in a sense, is the inability of the portrayer to tell apart subgroups of the portrayed. Much in the same way, you probably shouldn't trust anybody who thinks Africa is a country to have an opinion on anything to do with that continent. Now, I'm not actually very interested in whether Bram Stoker himself particularly was a part of this hatred directly, or merely, in all likelihood, a passive participant in the anti-Eastern milieu, because it is more about this being a signal point for this trope beginning to exist as a part of media. However, you don't really have to look far for other negative depictions of Eastern European characters in other pieces of literature, some of which I'm sure came earlier, though it most often showed up in propaganda pieces. In either case, the sentiment lasted pretty consistently throughout the Great Game between Russia and the UK, took a bit of a break during World War I, and then resurged strongly with the rise of the Soviet Union, which of course brings us to Part 2, the Cold War. This is probably the era you were thinking about in regards to this topic, as it is recent in terms of world history, and its cultural resonance will be with us at least until the last generation to have lived through it is gone. So we get a bit of a Red Scare post-World War I, but then we realize the Nazis are a bigger problem and help the Soviets. Then together, the UK and culturally connected US, alongside the Soviets and a bunch of other countries, helped defeat Nazism, and then everybody was happy and friendly to each other. For about a week. Cold War starts, new paradigm shift, and never before had the two preeminent powers in the world been so prominent. Maybe you could compare Rome and China, but they didn't interact nearly as much with each other. And as for Victorian Britain and Russia, while they were prominent, they were not hegemonic in the way that the East and West were during the Cold War. This shift and overwhelming power concentrated in the hands of two political entities and at certain times two individual people, not to mention those people's capacity to annihilate one another many times over, had, it is safe to say, a distinct effect on the cultures of both countries. And before I even talk about the Western angle of this, it is worth acknowledging that this too fostered an anti-Westernism in Russia in particular that, as far as I know, persists to this day. But of course, the closed-off nature of Soviet Russia and the fact that their satellite states did not generally share this sentiment has made this opinion's effect on the global zeitgeist practically non-existent compared to what we see in the West, which is hundreds and hundreds of books and movies and eventually video games that depict anyone with a name that ends in ov, ski, ko, or in as a downright fiend. Examples are so prevalent that you could probably pick a movie at random made between 1960 and 1989, and chances are, if it had an international villain, they were vaguely Slavic. None of this is to say we should be surprised, I guess. The West was cut off from the East, and vice versa, so it's not like there was a lot of talking and the general "hey, they're people too" conversations that tend to happen when people from politically opposed countries actually communicate. And so, why not make several James Bond villains Russian? Why not make a Rambo movie about helping the future Taliban fight the Soviets? I emphasize again that this is no big shock. Any given person probably would be afraid of the big red country that could turn their entire existence to dust in an instant, but that doesn't justify the continuous hatred aspect of it. Yet people, and as an American, I'm going to say mostly American people, I feel like, assume that everyone under that red banner totally was willing to nuke the West, be they Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, Czech, or what have you. Not that such a person knows that these are actually different nationalities and cultures, but you get what I mean. This is well demonstrated by the fact that, for one, by any given American, any Soviet could be at one's pleasure called a Russian or a Ruski, even though out of the nearly 400 million people living in the Soviet Union and the nations of the Warsaw Pact, only a bit less than a third of them were actually living in Russia. Of course, then the issue is arguably worsened by the fact that portrayals of these cultures in this media was almost universally terrible in ways that are actually often kind of funny. I mean, I showed this guy at the beginning of the video because Arnold's Russian isn't very good. Я даже не настолько хорош, и я это знаю. But other than that, you have lots of other depictions that are about on the same level, with another notable one being Ivan Drago, played by a Swede whose surname is not Russian, but does exist, though I think it's a first name, in certain Balkan languages, which perfectly proves my point about Americans not knowing the difference. Suffice it to say, there were a lot of vodka drunkensky characters out there. However, there was another thawing period as the Cold War came to a close, with perestroika actually inducing some tentatively more positive portrayals, until the Soviet Union's fall in 1991, after which we saw some legitimate positive Slavic characters in movies. But it remained mixed overall. To bring up James Bond again, GoldenEye, aside from maybe being the best James Bond movie with the best James Bond, and you can fight me on that, kind of was both, with several Russian protagonists and antagonists, from Natalia the Bond girl to Orumov the secondary antagonist to Boris Grishenko, which is actually a Ukrainian or Belarusian surname, who, I must say, this guy has some pretty great drip, despite being a terrible person, but maybe I'm biased on the drip front. Ultimately, this is about as good as it ever got on average, at least as far as East Slavic characters went. West Slavic people started having a bit of a break at this point, as most of the West Slavic countries joined NATO and could then legally be considered good people by the West. Though unfortunately, I actually feel like we don't see much from these groups in Western media, often requiring their own media to make its way here for their culture to be seen. Though it's been pretty great when that's happened, taking The Witcher and Kingdom Come Deliverance as examples, both of which are phenomenal. The South Slavs did not get a break, however, as the whole Yugoslavian explosion thing happened, and after the US got involved, we invented the Balkan bastard trope, so they got a whole new kind of negative depiction, even though up till now, they'd just been getting collaterally hated. So they got to be gang members and criminals for a while, though I'd say that particular trope isn't quite as common at this point, I don't think. In either case, we make our way out of the Cold War era finally to Part 3, the 21st century. So ultimately, depiction of Slavs, I would argue, became a little more varied as the 21st century came about, in part because Slavic culture finally became able to express itself to the West in meaningful ways it hadn't really been able to do since the times of Dostoevsky and Boleslav Prus. Thus, we have things like I mentioned earlier with KCD and Witcher, but also Stalker and Metro. These have generally been very well received. All four of these series are very well loved by their fan bases, Western or otherwise, and though I haven't gotten into Witcher quite yet, I do quite like the other three. And this proves there isn't some abstract, everlasting hate in the Western mind for the Eastern European, but it was a concept that had a lot of time to foster and was propelled by forces that would like you to hate them. The British gave their subjects an enemy in the Russian bear, the Americans gave patriots an enemy with the Red Scare, and the ramifications of these depictions really do stick around, if only in certain places. And of course, here I just want to note, it's not like it's inherently bad to have Slavic negative characters, as long as you treat them like other people as opposed to a caricature of their culture. And that, in particular, I feel has been becoming less common. But one of those certain places that I would argue we are seeing a little more of it in would be basically every modern Call of Duty, in which you mow down, usually Russians, by the hundred. In fact, as an odd development, those games are more likely to portray the Soviet Union as a positive entity than Russia itself. The former was only an antagonist in Black Ops 1 and Cold War, I believe, whereas it was a protagonist in each of the good World War II games. However, every Call of Duty that takes place in a modern setting, if it has Russians, has them as an enemy. However, the thing that is interesting to me about our era is that a lot of these previous ideas went away as particularly conscious decisions, at least that's how I feel about it. But they did remain as a sort of subconscious underlying understanding of what evil might look like in a lot of spaces. Vampires get vaguely Slavic accidents, though, once again, Dracula was Transylvanian, which we actually kind of see in the new Nosferatu movie, and that's actually why I mentioned Dracula earlier, where Nosferatu himself has the appearance, in part, of a Cossack so far as his mustache and hairstyle goes, which, while almost certainly not some intentional jab, is still being used as a cultural signifier for something that looks evil, because really, he shouldn't look like that given, for the third time now, he's not a Slavic character. In addition, evil-sounding names are often just Slavic ones in people's minds, and to circle all the way back around to that lazy world-building video, we get the Evil East as opposed to the vaguely Western European faction. Now, of course, whenever this happens, it just as often might make the East representative of the Middle East or China as being the big evil faction, but Eastern Europe is definitely still in the camp of being put on that side of the fence. And yet, I think we'll be seeing some of this more again, and really we already are, I'd argue, in limited ways. If you want to blame someone for that, I think there's a certain balding dictator with a strange obsession for the last letter of the English alphabet who might have something to do with it. It becomes another example, though, of being explainable but not justified. And I already know that there are going to be comments under this video about how Slavs, or likely more specifically Russians, deserve this treatment. Like, I know they'll be there eventually, and they won't have made it to this part of the video. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying governments should be immune to criticism or even hatred, but it seems once again generally hateful people will dig out the old punching bag and strike it a few more times because they can't separate government from people. But as with all such cases, these sentiments don't match actual reality. Almost ever. I have a Russian pen pal who helps me study the language, and he's an expat who fled because he didn't want to involve himself with the ongoing conflict. He's a pretty cool guy, like anyone else from any other country can be. And even among my viewers, there are Russians and other Slavs, from Poles to Slovenes, and guess what? They've all been pretty cool. To compound on this whole situation, remember that whole anti-Westernism thing I was talking about that was fostered in Cold War Russia? That too is still a thing, as I understand it at least, and only furthers the cultural division that I fear is going to keep this stupid cultural feud going on for some time. Now, in regards to this whole situation, you might be asking, why do I care about this specifically? But for one, I'm Slavic, a fact most commonly expressed in my life by people being unable to pronounce my last name, which I'd love to give examples of, but I'm not quite that stupid. But that has in part led me to develop an interest in Slavic culture. I'm most knowledgeable about East Slavic cultures, which has made the past few years particularly kind of depressing. But I've also seen so many interesting things from that part of the world, especially in terms of those cultures' expressions through media. I wrote this entire video script listening to Karoli Shuts' Akustichesky and Budkak Doma Putnik albums, but between movies like Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker film, Elem Klimov's Come and See, or Idi Smatri, and tons of other musical groups from stars like Viktor Tsoi's Kino to Liapis Trubetskoy, Molcha Doma, or Arkona. There's a lot of wonderful stuff to find, and what I find is the same concerns, interests, and desire to connect with the rest of the world that one should expect from anyone else. So maybe you're sitting here and you've noticed that sort of aura of negativity around Slavic portrayals. I recommend you check some of these out. Just do something a little different to maybe adjust your conceptions. I mean, most cultures have a stereotype in the West, and I challenge you to think of one for Slavs that isn't alcoholism. The only one I can think of that's vaguely positive is the Polish having, like, the winged hussars, which is really cool, but that's a historical fact, not really a stereotype. What you should be thinking of is the Bober meme, because it's very funny, and because I want to talk about something positive in this video, and I've watched this big rat get spun around in circles for an unhealthy amount of time. I know this has nothing to do with the topic at hand, but it's my video, and I can do what I want. I demand more Bober. With that minor psychotic break resulting from me writing this script at 4 AM in mind, I hope you enjoyed the video, or at least the Bober. If you have any thoughts of your own about Slavic portrayals in Western media, I read every comment and would love to see your thoughts. Also, if you yourself are Slavic, drop some media recommendations from your culture in the comments. In addition, every like and subscription goes a long way since we're still small here at JBat. We also have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want that, where we post all of our videos a week early. On that note, I'd like to thank our patrons: Shadowrunner, Sani, Newly, Isaac Parrott, who are our Knights of the Inner Circle, Nico, our knight, and Greer, our loyal squire. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and remember, if you're going to show someone Soviet films, be careful before recommending them to watch Come and See.